Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I'm going to talk about heroes once again, but in a roundabout way. I'm going to talk about, once again, why you see these ugly characters right now being portrayed as heroes. Now, I've touched on this before, but today I want to talk more about why these characters are ugly in character themselves. That is to say, if they were real people, the character of those people would be an ugly thing. And quite specifically, I want to talk about why you see these ugly female characters. Again, ugly in spirit, ugly in character themselves. And quite honestly, I would say the main reason why you would see these ugly in character characters, especially the female ones, is because they're the exact opposite of what Spider-Man Peter Parker is actually based upon. The idea of, with great power comes great responsibility. And just briefly before I begin, I will link that old video about ugly characters in the description, and at the same time to let you know that I'm going to give you a background image of beautiful women, not ugly women. If you want to go see ugly women, go back to that older video. People don't want to see that. That's really the point of why I'm talking about this. So if I was to give this phenomena a name, I would probably call it the Disney Princess Syndrome. Because really, I think that's where the main thrust of this ugly in spirit characters comes from. And since it has a lot to do with Disney princesses, I want to go back a little farther to the original stories from which these Disney princess stories come from. I want to go back to things like the Grimm fairy tales and other kinds of Mother Goose tales, just for a minute. So the thing is, about these older Grimm fairy tales and the like, really what they were was a morality play for children. And this is where we get the fundamental idea of the hero's journey, is from these old stories. And the hero's journey, well, there are several different ways in which it has been expressed. I'll put one of those ways up in the background. But the one that I'm typically familiar with is where you have a person and they're confronted with something that they can't overcome. And so they go on a journey, and on this journey they gain new experience, new knowledge, and from that, then they know better how to deal with the same problem when it happens again. Then they overcome that problem, and when this person comes back from their journey, they come back the wiser, and they come back a hero because they are now triumphant over the thing which previously had defeated them. Now, this idea of the hero's journey in all its incarnations, as I said, there are several different ways to express it, but all of them really come back to what we see expressed within things like Grimm fairy tales. That is the origin of this idea. That's where some of the people who came up with this idea actually got their inspiration from, or say they got their inspiration from. Now, here's the thing. I would say, sure, they got their inspiration from that. But really, all this hero's journey is, and really I would say a whole lot of explanation of literature that you see around you today, is simply a restatement of what Aristotle said 2,400 years ago. So yeah, they give it to you in a modern package and they might flush it out a little bit, but really that's all they're doing. And the thing is that this hero's journey, which they take from stuff like the Grimm fairy tales, is in itself a teaching of morality which goes way back to the ancients and their idea of what conscience is. Because if you go back to the ancient expression of what a conscience is and how it works, it fits almost exactly to a T what you would describe as the hero's journey. Because the way a conscience is supposed to work, well, it's supposed to be dependent upon that phrase conscience, or the string of words that is really in Latin in our English way of expressing it, which says it is a re-examination of what you understand. And the reason why you need to re-examine what you understand is because you go through the basic same steps as a hero's journey. A person is confronted with a problem. They think from their knowledge base that they know how to deal with this problem. Therefore, they deal with it in the way they think will actually turn out well for them. But it doesn't turn out well for them, and so they learn that through this suffering that they had to endure by it not working out for them, that what they understood before was actually lacking in some way. And so their conscience tells them you need to re-examine what you understand in order to look at it in this new light of what you now understand because of the pain and suffering you had to go through by enduring what you thought was going to work out well for you, but did not. And when that person re-understands what their knowledge is according to what they have gone through, then they gain new knowledge, and that new knowledge, at the very least, will give them additional information so that when they face this problem again, or a similar problem again, they know how to get around it, or at the very least that the path they took last time was an incorrect path. So again, that's just the ancient way of looking at how a conscience works. And really, I would say Grimm fairy tales and the other kinds of fairy tales where everybody today get this idea of the hero's journey, all they're describing in a non-moral language kind of way is the morality of teaching children how your conscience works and saying, this is the fundamental way that you should understand the world. It's through your conscience. You go through this hero's journey, which is basically a way of saying, once again, that this is how you interpret things through your conscience. This is the morality which is taught with these stories. And the thing is that with this morality also comes a secondary effect, and that effect is to become responsible, at the very least self-responsible. Because if you've learned something new, then you know from your actions that you're not going to do that again. You become more self-responsible. You know that if you're going to be faced again with the same or a similar problem, you know not to do what you did before. It's funny because a long time ago, I used to watch WB shows before it became the CW, and I used to watch these characters, and at the first, when they would come into a problem and it would work out poorly for them, I would be a little bit sympathetic to their plight. But after they did the exact same thing over and over and over again in the exact same way, and kept on going to the exact same problem, and kept on having to go through the exact same pain, I said to myself, I don't care. You should have learned the first time, because if you don't learn the first time, you're not becoming responsible for your own actions. But here's the thing. If we move on from those early fairy tales and go into a more modern context of fairy tales, we see the deliberate removal of this morality aspect to the story. Now, I would take the greatest example of this being the writing of The Wizard of Oz, which was published in 1900. Because Frank Baum, the writer, actually wrote a foreword to that book later on after it became popular, and he quite specifically states the reason why he wanted to write this story in the way he did was to remove morality from children's stories. Because his stated purpose, that is to say, if you believe his stated purpose, was because he thought that the children got enough of that from their home, from their parents, from their teachers, therefore they didn't need to be hit over the head again with their stories. And this kind of modern way of telling a children's story went right into the movie of The Wizard of Oz, which came out in, I think, 1939, and your Disney princess kind of movies, which started in 1938. You have the deliberate removal of this idea of morality from the underlying reason why the story is being told. Now, you could say that's a good thing or that's a bad thing, depending on what you think a story is actually about and how it's supposed to be constructed. But the thing is that what I want to concentrate on is if you remove that morality aspect, you also remove the aspect of responsibility and the child learning about self-responsibility. Because again, the whole hero's journey is just a way for children to understand the ancient concept, and really the concept that went all the way through Western civilization, of how a conscience works, and how you're supposed to get out of a problem, how you actually live your life by using your conscience to figure out what actually is right and what actually is wrong, and again, so you can overcome the problem when you encounter it in the future. However, I would say, and perhaps this is just me personally, and I think this way, but I would say there was a natural backstop for this responsibility once you started to get into these Disney princess kinds of movies. And that was the male character within these movies. Because you see, the majority of these movies and these princess characters that we still have around today being produced in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And so you still had this idea that the man was going to take responsibility in the end. And so you had this princess who doesn't have any responsibility, who has power and privilege because she's a princess, but no responsibility, again, because you don't have that morality aspect in the background. Therefore, there's no teaching of responsibility. Therefore, the character doesn't need to be responsible. But the backstop for that responsibility is the male character, again, because of the time in which a lot of these stories were brought out. And although I would say Disney faltered a great deal in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, when you got into the stories from the 80s, late 80s and 90s, things like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and those kinds of re-energizing of the Disney stories, you still had the same basic formula. That's what they fell back on. So you still had that backstop of the man as being responsible in the end. But if you get into the 2000s, and especially the 2010s, you see a distinct shift in these stories. And that distinct shift in these stories is the erasure of the man from the story, or at the very least, making the man a buffoon. And what this does is it removes that basic backstop. It removes that emergency stop that was put in there after the morality from these stories was removed. And briefly, I would add, you see the sanitization of these stories. If you go back to the original Grimm fairy tales, there's a reason why we have the word Grimm in the English language. Some of the things within these older stories would make you recoil in horror, but they were taken away. Just to give you an example, I think the original story of Cinderella, you had the wicked stepsisters, and when they tried to put their foot in the shoe or the slipper, and it's different in different forms, one of them cut off all of her toes and the other one cut off her heel to try to make it fit into the slipper. And at the same time, when you have that Disney vision of that character where you had her dancing around with all these little birds flying over her head, yeah, those birds were in the original. What did they do in the original? Well, at the end, they pecked out the eyes of the wicked stepsisters. And these horrible things that happened within these stories weren't just against the antagonist or the villain. These heroes had to go through some horrific things as well. And again, I would say why that was there was to drive home the point of the morality that was being taught. To drive home to these children, see, look, if you don't handle things this way, using your conscience to figure these things out, you're going to become wicked, you're going to become like these people, and then horrible things are going to happen to you. And so, again, with the removal of that morality aspect, you didn't need these horrible things within the stories anymore. And so, this is one of the reasons why you would see in these Disney stories the removal of all these horrible aspects from the story themselves. But the point being, really, is that again, it doesn't matter if you think this was a good thing or a bad thing. With the removal of this moral aspect to these stories, and then the removal of that emergency stop of the man taking responsibility for the woman in these stories, you have a story where you have a princess, a person with power and with privilege, but zero responsibility. And that's the kind of story that they're teaching to young children, especially to young girls. You should be someone who wants power and privilege and no responsibility. And you can see this kind of archetype within not only Disney stories, but a whole lot of different kinds of stories today. Just sticking with Disney stories for the moment, if you look at something like Frozen, you have a princess. She has power and privilege, and then she goes around singing about how she's now free, and she doesn't even have to follow right or wrong. That is a perfect example of power and privilege with zero responsibility. Let's look at another science fiction fantasy version of a Disney tale, which would be the new Star Wars movies. With Rey, you have Rey who has power and privilege, but doesn't even need to go through the responsibility of having to learn how to use all of this power and privilege, because that would be contrary to the way they want to tell the story, especially to young girls, being again that you get power and you get privilege and you don't have to worry about responsibility. And of course, lest we think this is just an analyzing of what we see within our entertainment and within our literature, we can look around in the real world and see the exact same examples coming to life. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of all of this story, but if you look at the British royal family, where you had one of Prince Charles' sons, I don't even know his name, I think it was Harry, and he married a very woke woman, and this woman wanted to become a princess. She wanted to have the power and privilege of a princess, but when she had to deal with the responsibilities of being a princess, then she said, no, we have to leave. And so that's what they did. And they thought, I think, contrary to what the Queen actually allowed them to do in the end, was that they, or at least she, was hoping to retain all of the power and privilege of being a princess, but have none of the responsibilities. That's what she wanted. And you also see this coming up within arguments within the political today, because you have these feminists who are always arguing that women and men are exactly the same and that women can do just exactly the same as men. But when the idea of, okay, then women should be subject to the draft just the same as men comes up, then they say, oh, no, we don't want to do that. No, we don't want that. That's not part of what we're actually asking for. You can't do that to us. Why? Because again, they want this power and this privilege, but no responsibility. And this plays into so many of the things I've talked about within my videos over the course of my channel. It plays into the idea of a Mary Sue. It plays into the idea of women wanting to be ultimately secure, and that's what they crave at their heart. It plays into the idea of liberty being redefined as I get to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. Because if someone has power and privilege but no responsibility, then that's exactly what they get to do. It also plays into the idea that women are saints and men are evil. And this is an idea which comes from feminism. And I've gone over this a couple of times in the past, but what it basically was feminists coming up with these ideas of how to change basically the North American judicial system, and they came up with straight up lies and massaged information which didn't have anything that would contradict their narrative that women were essentially saints and men were evil. And so if it came down into a law court of a he said, she said scenario, the woman would always be believed above the man. And again, they just come out and say this is what they were doing over the last 40 years now, because it's so ingrained within the legal system. They don't care. They come out and say, yeah, we were lying. Yeah, we massaged the information to get it our way. This is the idea they implanted within our Western society institutions. And this mindset pervades into our storytelling as well. I listen to a lot of podcasts from Marvel, which, again, is owned by Disney. And one of these podcasts that I listen to a lot is the Women of Marvel podcasts. And within these podcasts, the women who are on these podcasts, even the ones who come on as guests, not just the ones who run it, but they all have the same mindset. They have this exact same mindset that women are saints and men are evil. And they talk about this over and over again. I think they had an entire year's worth of podcast about it at one point, where they explain it according to the feminist way of speaking, which is to say that women have empowerment, men have power. Power, the masculine, is destructive. Empowerment, the feminine, is creative. And again, they go over this over and over again, and they use this language constantly. And once again, I have to point out that this language being used and this underlying idea, this isn't just some fringe podcast that Marvel has. This was a podcast created by and run by, for the majority of its life, the second in command at Marvel Comics, the person in control of character development. And so you take those two ideas and put them together. The idea that women are saintly by their nature, then you come to the automatic conclusion that, yes, women should have power and privilege. It should be given to them. They should take it away from men and give it to the women, because the women would handle it correctly. This is the underlying assumption, once again, not only for these podcasts, but for the stories that you see around you today. And again, there doesn't need to be this idea of responsibility, and certainly not self-responsibility. Why? Because of course, if you have an individual who is a saintly individual, they're just going to do, by nature of who they are, which is a woman, what is the responsible thing to do? They don't need to be taught responsibility. They don't need to take self-responsibility, because according to this mindset, they're just going to be responsible naturally. And just briefly, as I have covered on some of my videos, this way of thinking about women was actually specifically taught from feminism to these other disciplines. That's what they did. They used the language of infecting other disciplines as if they were a virus. And these other disciplines now are disciplines now where you see the exact same mindset. The mindset of people of color being automatically more virtuous than other people, or people, these pronoun people, being automatically more virtuous, automatically being better people by who they are than your normal everyday individuals. Certainly your normal everyday, what they call cisgendered white male. And this is why you get characters over and over again, characters like what Richard would call a soulful saint, which would be a person of color, which is automatically a saintly person. Or you get these characters where you don't have to actually talk about, explain, show any of their actions to put this person into the category of hero, all you got to do is label them, oh, they're part of the LGBTQ community, therefore automatically they're a saintly person. Therefore, automatically, by virtue of who and what they are, you consider them a hero. Or, at the very least, that's how the story presents it. And there's no wonder that such people who write these characters are actually attracted to one kind of political ideology. Because there's one kind of political ideology, far leftist ideology or quote-unquote progressive ideology, that follows the same mindset. The mindset of, I don't need to take personal responsibility. Because the more and more conservative you are, the more and more you take the mindset that if I have a problem in my life, where am I going to look to actually A, pin the blame, and B, fix this problem? Well, the more conservative you are, I would say the more likely you are to look in the mirror. That's where you're going to understand the problem lies. That's where you understand what you need to fix. And again, that's personal responsibility. But the farther left you go, the more when a person runs up against something in their life that isn't right, they don't look at themselves, they point the finger at others. And this is exactly the mindset of, I deserve power and privilege without having to take any responsibility, certainly no responsibility that is personal for myself or upon myself. But the thing is that you and I would say probably most people out here in the real world, we understand that this idea is a bunch of nonsense, especially the idea that men and women are divided where women are saints and men are devils. We all know that men and women can be equally heroic as well as equally nasty. Yeah, sure, they might express it in different ways, but they can be as equally nasty. You can't look upon one and say, yeah, you're automatically going to be given an easier treatment because you are automatically a saint by nature of being a woman. It doesn't work that way. But the point being that if you have these people who have such a mindset and create characters based upon that mindset, what kind of character does this character have? Well, they're a nasty person. They're a person, again, that takes no personal responsibility, but believes themselves to be ultimately virtuous without having done anything, that they are naturally virtuous so that they can and should actually be the ones to possess this power and privilege and not have any responsibility for it. And I want to give you very briefly just two examples of this from comics. The one that got me thinking about this to begin with was Wonder Girl. Now, CW was recently sold, and the CW was going to come out with a new show based upon Wonder Girl. But since they got sold, then they canceled the production of that show. Then DC canceled the book that came out for Wonder Girl. And this points to one of the things I used to talk about a lot, is the fact that comic books are no longer for publishing comic books. They're simply to get you invested in a movie or a television show. But anyway, so with the cancellation of the book for Wonder Girl, you had a lot of people coming out and saying, it's really a shame. This was a good character. And I'm looking at it going, what? This was a horrible character. She was a horrible person. Now, admittedly, I didn't read all of the books that came out. I think only about 7 came out. I read the first 2, and I'm firmly of the opinion, I'll typically give you 3 strikes and then you're out. But this one I couldn't even get to 3 strikes. I got to 2, and I looked at it and I said, no, she's a horrible person. Why in the world would I want to read stories about this horrible person? And I'm sure someone is saying to themselves, well, you didn't read the whole thing. You see that she becomes better in the end. That might have happened in later issues, I can grant you that, but it really doesn't matter. Again, first impressions are extremely important. If you're going to show me to be an extremely horrible person in the first 2 issues, then no. I don't care what you do in the rest of the story. I don't care if you do heroic things. You could be doing those heroic things because you're being selfish. I don't know your motivation, and your motivation is just as equally important as the fact that you do those things. And again, if your first impression of this character is you're a horrible person, then I'm going to question everything you do, saying, is this just a self-interested thing that this character does? And just briefly, the way that I looked at it, within the first issue, you had this introduction of this character. Again, this character did come out in other stories prior to that, but that was really a different alternate universe version of the character. So this was supposed to be the introduction of this character in the main DC universe. So the introduction, the number 1, the first impression of this character was that she was on a plane and she was talking the ear off of this elderly woman, and she was telling her about her mother, who she thought was horrible for not allowing her as a young girl, as a teenager, to go from one continent to another because that's where her heritage was. She lived in North America. She wanted to go to South America to explore her heritage, and her mother, who was actually her stepmother, said, no, you can't do that. And so she was complaining to a perfect stranger about how horrible this was that her stepmother did this. Now, to me, again, this says you're a horrible person. You have this woman who raised you, not only raised you, but she wasn't your actual mother. She was your stepmother. So she had no compunction to raise you at all, but she went through the process of raising you, and here you are bad-mouthing her to a complete stranger on a plane because she didn't allow you to do every little absurd thing you wanted to do in your life. And really, I would say it is an absurd thing as a teenager to ask your mother to go from one continent to another so you can explore your heritage. So again, this character, to me, that scene, which was really the opening scene, the introduction for this character, that's a horrible person. Or at the very least, it's a spoiled brat. But it's a perfect example of what I've been talking about. The perfect example of I want to have liberty under the definition of I want to do whatever I want to do without any stops to that at all. And that goes back to I want power, I want privilege, but I don't want any responsibility. And the other older example of this would be Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel, who killed Rhodey in one of the older stories. But within the last couple of years, the character of Rhodey was resurrected. And what did this character of Rhodey do when he met Carol Danvers again? Well, he automatically forgave her, and not just automatically forgave her, but then became her boy toy. I'm sorry, but that's just a way of saying she takes no personal responsibility whatsoever for murdering this individual. So those are just two examples, and I'm sure you can come up with your own examples, whether they're from comics, whether they're from television, movies, gaming, anything. You could go over some characters that you passionately dislike and fit them into this exact mold. And that's my main argument as to why these characters are horrible in spirit. But I would say there's a minor argument to this as well. And this is an argument that just came to me as an offhand remark that someone made. And the offhand remark was a man saying that I have gained some life experience now, and I understand that, quite honestly, women are always in some kind of pain. Whether it be small or large, they're always in some kind of pain. And I thought, that kind of explains a lot. And so I asked some of my female friends about this, and while they didn't wholeheartedly agree with it, they did acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of days in their lives where all they're trying to do is get through the day with a minimum of pain. Now, as a healthy guy, I can tell you right now, that is a foreign concept completely. I can go an entire year without getting sick at all, or experiencing any real pain. Usually I get sick once or twice a year. It really depends now on how self-responsible I am, if I want to be around people or not, because I'm out in the woods, so I'm not around people a lot, so I don't catch a lot of the things that are going around. But that's typically the only time I get sick during a year, is when I have the flu or a cold. That's about it. I don't experience pain in any way, certainly not in a way that I have to actually guard myself against it. Not at all. And this is the natural way I would say a healthy guy actually lives. But the point I want to concentrate on is the fact that these women, which are in pain for a lot of their lives, or at the very least for very specific moments in their life, and it's naturally going to be there, they now have no outlet and no way to A, understand, and B, deal with this pain. And again, I would say it comes back to a lot of social factors, but those things are simply missing now. If you go back, once again, to morality, and I don't want to specifically equate religion with morality, although religion should be about morality, you have these major religions, and at the very least, they give you a context for pain, and sometimes a way that you can deal with pain. In my tradition, it's taught that, yes, pain is going to be there, it's going to be part of your life, and it's not a good thing, but you should use it when it comes. And the most basic way that you can use it is as a sacrifice. And so this is what you do with your pain. Or you can have the English way of thinking, which is stiff upper lip and carry on. That stoic idea of how to deal with pain. So for that culture, for people who are in that culture or in societies which express the same kind of idea, yeah, you have a reason for carrying on. You have a reason for dealing with this pain. That's what you're supposed to do. Or you can have a more natural explanation and way of dealing with this, just simply by being a mother. You understand that as a mother, yeah, pain is going to come, but I'm going to get through this pain, no matter what it is, for my children. And you understand that right from the very beginning because childbirth is a painful thing, and you did it for your children. That was self-sacrifice. But what do you have today? You have a lot of these women who don't know anything about raising a child, certainly anything about having a child. They don't understand self-sacrifice of being a mother. They don't have an idea that English culture should be respected in any way. So the idea of stiff upper lip and carry on, that is something which they see as patriarchal and something they need to get rid of. And to them as well, you have to get rid of these old notions of morality that come to you through religion. So they have no way of dealing with and understanding their own pain. And so if they're going to be experiencing a lot of pain in their lives, and especially if they have something to compare it to, a time in their life, which when they were young girls, they didn't experience that pain, they know they can go through life without pain, and they have this entire section of people, which are men, standing next to them who don't have to go through this, what are they going to do with that pain? Well, typically, if they have no other outlet for this pain, what I think they're going to do with it, and what I think they do with it within our society right now, is inflict it upon other people. And this is where you get the idea of a Karen. Because I would say, if you're actually wronged, sure, complain about it. You should complain about it when you are wronged, when something unjust happens to you. But these Karens, what they do is, it's not that they're wronged, it's that their power and their privilege has been questioned, and therefore they need to take responsibility for something. That pain comes to them, and they don't know how to deal with that pain, they don't know how to deal with that responsibility, so they just turn around and inflict that pain upon other people. So again, the point being that for these people who believe that they are soulful saints, that they can do no wrong because of just who they are, and they deserve power and privilege, and they don't have to deal with any of this responsibility, then they naturally, again, think that when pain comes their way, it's someone else's problem, it's someone else's fault. And at the very least, if they have to go through it, and they have no way of expressing or understanding this pain, they're gonna inflict it upon others. What kind of character does that give a person? That is a horrible person. That is a person that is steeped in their own vice, and at the same time think themselves heroic. And that's why they create characters on the page that are ugly characters, because the writers themselves are ugly in spirit. And I can tell you right now, for myself, I don't want to read, watch, interact with such people or characters in any way. Why would I subject myself to that? And the funny thing is, as I said, these writers and these producers of these stories believe they're actually putting a hero down on the page. I have gone, once again, over so many Marvel podcasts where they talk about the phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility," because they actually believe they're being responsible. They actually believe they're putting a hero down on the page and themselves acting in a heroic way because they see it as their responsibility, as the perfect people that they see themselves as, not to take responsibility for their own actions, but to take responsibility for the actions of all the society, because the evil comes from without. It comes from the society. It comes from those bad sections of society, and so they need to use their power and their privilege to reform those evil people. That's what they believe. They believe they're taking responsibility for themselves and their power by telling other people what to do. And right now we got more and more people waking up to the simple fact that, I'm sorry, you people, you're not presenting us heroes. And you yourself, you're not virtuous. You're not a hero either. You're the villain. You're the ones who actually are what we should be fighting against. Because you progressive person, you're hateful, you're vengeful, and what that makes you, no matter what you look like, is an ugly person. So, If I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.